Hi, family, and welcome back to the Mount Moriah Baptist Church YouTube channel. We're so glad you're here. Thanks for joining us in another video of the life of Jesus.
Now, let's read Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. He said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you."
Okay, now let's break this down using observation. What's going on in this passage? Now, the Beatitudes represent a radical shift in understanding God's blessings and the values of the kingdom of heaven. So, unlike the conventional wisdom of the time, which often focused on things like wealth and power, self sufficiency, those kinds of things, they saw that as a sign of divine favor. However, Jesus came in and outlined a different path that people could take. His blessings are not given to the powerful or those that are in positions of privilege, but to those that are humble, to the merciful, the meek, those who hunger or thirst for righteousness, right? As we read, these eight blessings reveal kind of a paradoxical truth that God's kingdom often stands in contrast to worldly success and happiness. So these promises seek a deeper kind of fulfillment, right? They call us to think about how these promises can be, or what am I trying to say? They can transcend basically the temporary or kind of fleeting pleasures of the world. And so this sermon, or the beginning of this sermon, is delivered early on in Jesus' ministry, and it kind of laid the foundation for a lot of his teaching. They aren't just words of comfort, right? We often like, or different like platitudes for suffering. They offer a deeper insight into the nature of God's kingdom and its transformative power. Jesus' message here invites his followers to live with humility and mercy and righteousness, all of which are values that God loves us and that God wants justice for us. So the Sermon on the Mount, which begins here in chapter 5 and runs through chapter 7 of Matthew, begins with the Beatitudes, and it serves as a blueprint for Christian discipleship. It challenges believers to embody the love and mercy of God in their daily lives, right? So true fulfillment, Jesus teaches us here, is found in following God's will, not in earthly power or wealth. So Jesus is not calling his listeners here to earn salvation through behavior. That's not what these are for. The Beatitudes are not a list of things that one must do in order to earn God's favor or even enter into the kingdom of heaven. They are expressions of God's grace. They are describing the qualities of those that are already a part of the kingdom, right? So the Beatitudes is not a checklist for salvation. Just so you know, according to the Bible, salvation is achieved through faith in Jesus Christ, who died for our sins and rose again. And by confessing him as Lord and believing in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will have salvation. So that's not what this says. So just so you have that as a little fun fact. Also, the Beatitudes are not burdensome ethical demands. They aren't rules to follow, but rather they are promises of blessing, right? With the only command within this entire passage being to rejoice in the midst of persecution, right? And then lastly, thinking about these blessings as being both present and future tense. So the Beatitudes are not just about a distant future reward at the end of time. While some blessings like comfort for those who mourn will be fully realized in the future, for example, others like the promise of the kingdom of heaven for the poor in spirit are present realities, right? Jesus is pointing out that the blessings of God are already available to us, right, as his followers now. Even if they look like they're far off, right? And the full fulfillment of them would be in the future. So I do want to talk a little bit just about each one, just kind of highlighting to make sure that we understand all of the Beatitudes that are there. So first we have blessed or blessed are the poor in spirit. This refers to those who are spiritually oppressed or are in need of God's help, not just the economically poor or financially poor. Jesus challenges the idea that material blessing always indicates God's favor, and that this teaches that the kingdom of heaven belongs to those who are spiritually humble, unlike the self sufficient religious leaders of the time. Next, blessed are those who mourn. So, mourning over loss, whether it's of loved ones, of status, of spiritual standing, is part of life within the kingdom of heaven. So, through mourning, believers also can experience God's comfort, which shows kind of this tension of living in the, already not yet kingdom, right? So, I can experience it now, almost, sort of, kind of. Right? It gets a little tricky, but just remember that mourning over loss, whether it's loved one status, standing, so on and so forth, is a part of the kingdom. Next, let's look at blessed are the meek. So the meek, or also means gentle, will inherit the earth, which is in contrast to the domineering, right? The kind of overbearing. So meekness involves strength under control, right? And Jesus really does a really great job of exemplifying that particular quality, showing that it's about selfless endurance to fulfill God's purposes. And we'll see that reflected in some future passages. Next, blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. So, righteousness includes justice, it includes a personal, ethical living, and it includes God's saving activity, right? Those who deeply long for these things will be filled, right? Experiencing divine satisfaction both now and in the future reign of God, which is just wonderful. And it encourages us to continuously kind of desire after those things, right? After righteousness. Next, blessed are the merciful. So mercy is a heart attitude, right? It's a heart attitude that opens people to receiving God's mercy, right? It's not about necessarily earning the kingdom, but rather reflecting God's mercy, as we can see throughout some of the Old Testament teachings, especially within Micah chapter 6, right? So it's saying, if you want to receive mercy, then you need to also show mercy to others. Blessed are the pure in heart. So Jesus emphasizes that true purity comes from the heart, right? It's not an external observance of laws. And we'll see that later on in a later passage as well. But a pure heart leads to genuine purity within one's life. Next, blessed are the peacemakers. So Jesus values peace over political or military attempts at control, right? Peacemakers reflect God's peace. And with Jesus being the ultimate peacemaker, kind of reconciling humanity with God. And then it's not technically one, but we kind of consider it, it's almost like it's included here. These two kind of go together here about being persecuted. But blessed are those persecuted for righteousness. Persecution for doing right is not necessarily a way to earn the kingdom, but is a comfort for those who suffer unjustly, right? Jesus offers us hope that despite persecution, the kingdom is still yours, right? The kingdom is still yours to have. And that you should rejoice, right? The only action we really have here, you should rejoice in that. And with that, we'll move on to the next passage.
Now let's read Mark chapter 4, verses 35 through 41. That day, when evening came, he said to his disciples, "Let us go over to the other side." Leaving the crowd behind, they took him along, just as he was, in the boat. There were also other boats with him. A furious squall came up, and the waves broke over the boat, so that it was nearly swamped. Jesus was in the stern, sleeping on a cushion. The disciples woke him and said to him, "Teacher, don't you care if we drown?" He got up, rebuked the wind, and said to the waves, "Quiet, be still." When the wind died down and it was completely calm, he said to his disciples, "Why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith?" They were terrified and asked each other, "Who is this? Even the wind and the waves obey him."
All right, let's go ahead and explore what's going on in this passage. So this first line here, if you were to translate that in the original Greek, it would read something like, "And he continued to speak to them on that day." And so this story kind of comes on the heels of all of Jesus' special teaching to his disciples on the nature of the kingdom of heaven. He's kind of characterizing that kingdom as being hidden, that it's couched among secrecy, and that it requires almost like a special gift or talent of hearing in order to comprehend. And so he's trying to help them navigate and understand that. So then they set off. So Jesus and his disciples were traveling by boat when a storm arose, threatening to sink the boat. Jesus was asleep. He was sleeping during the storm, showing his calmness and his trust in God. And the disciples woke him up, right, fearing for their lives. And he calmed the storm with his words, "Quiet, be still." You may have also heard it translated, "Peace, be still." Jesus rebuked his disciples for their fear and lack of faith. But, the disciples continued to be amazed by his power over nature. And they even questioned, they're like, "Who is this guy?" Right? Who is this? And so I want to talk a little bit about some of the symbolism that's going on here. First, having to deal with the storm. I hope you like my little rain cloud, my lightning. But thinking about storms, thanks to modern technology, we have tools and professionals in place that can help tell us a little bit about severe weather so that we can prepare and better kind of take cover for these kinds of things. However, there's really no storm tracker for life's unexpected challenges, right? There's no storm tracker that can predict when you're going to experience an emotional storm, a health-related storm, a relationship storm, a children's storm, financial storm, career storm, right? You name it. And much like the squall at sea, we often find ourselves in the midst of multiple storms all at once. And you see, these kinds of storms can appear suddenly, almost out of nowhere and intensify quickly with so much force that almost causes you to become overwhelmed and to remain localized, right? So squalls are the types of storms that even if one storm is passing, it feels as though it's following you around. Have you ever seen those cartoons where someone is sad? So there's like a rain cloud above them that's only raining on them. That's what a squall looks like. There's all this sunshine around the storm, but it's so localized, it almost feels personal, right? And these emotional, financial health, so on and so forth, different kinds of storms that we face can also feel isolating, right? It can feel as though we're the only ones experiencing the storm. But I'm here to tell you that many others may be facing storms of their own. So, thinking about squalls, you might also see some visual cues. They're not always there, but some of the visual cues, the darkening of the sky, clouds seeming to gather all in one place, and then it just kind of happens really, really fast. You might also see signs of some of these storms, like emotional exhaustion or relationship tensions or financial strain, right? Things like that. They don't always, signal exactly when or how long a storm is going to hit. And sometimes the storm seems to go on for so long that it's easy for us to fall into this trap of thinking, when this storm is over, then I'll be at peace, or when I have that job or that money or that marriage or that degree or that baby or that whatever, then I'll be happy, right? But this mindset can sometimes lead us to be in a constant cycle of waiting for peace to come only after a particular set of circumstances have been met. And the key here, I think, and the significance of this storm is to embrace peace now and not necessarily waiting for the storm to pass. Because true peace comes not from external circumstances, but from within. So, no matter what storm you may be facing, whether it's emotional, whether it's relational, financial, whatever it might be, you can choose to have peace in the midst of it, right? Jesus did. Jesus was chilling, right? And so I think it's really important to understand that even when life is unpredictable and it's turbulent and it just seems all out of control and chaotic, that peace is something that we can access through our faith and our trust in God's presence with us. And that makes me really, really happy. Next, I want to talk about discipleship when it comes to this passage here. So, on one level, this passage emphasizes Jesus' divine authority, right? He commands the storm to cease with, a simple command: quiet, be still. Right? That's what I tell my dog. Y'all might hear him whining in the background, right? Quiet, be still. And, while I only have power over this dog, Jesus has divine authority over all of creation. And so he uses this moment to demonstrate his power over nature and aligning with a lot of the other miracles that take place in some of the earlier chapters within the book of Mark. This miracle really does confirm that Jesus is not just a teacher, but he's the Messiah, again, having power over all of creation. On another level, this story really does kind of serve as a parable of discipleship, right? So the disciples' journey begins with an invitation from Jesus, right? Let us go across to the other side. This mirrors the call that he gave to the first disciples within chapter 1 of Mark, where he invited them to follow him into the unknown. And in both instances, they obediently respond. Now, at the start of this journey, everything seems peaceful. Again, a squall is sudden, it happens out of nowhere, right? So these disciples here are on a mission with Jesus. They feel secure in his presence, but then suddenly a violent storm arises, right? Without warning, they're knocked off of the peaceful circumstances that they had, and they're having to figure out, okay, what now? Like everything was, peaceful when nothing was going wrong, right? Yes, Lord, I felt secure with you because nothing, I didn't need to lean into your security, right? And so the boat within this story helps to symbolize safety and peace. It begins to fill with water, and it made me think about, what are those crutches that we have, those things that we think are giving us peace, those things that we think are making us feel secure. What happens when they start to fail? Right? What happens when they're no longer doing the thing that we want them to do, or the thing that we thought that they were going to do? So this unexpected crisis shows that discipleship, right, following Jesus, is not free from struggles, but it does remind us that even when we are with Jesus and challenges arise, that he is still with us and he is still guiding us through that chaos. And that is very comforting for me. And then the last thing I want to talk about here is this idea of fear and faith, and how there's a very thin line between fear and faith. So once the storm is calmed, Jesus takes it as an opportunity to teach his disciples, right? He talks about, like he did in his earlier parables, he interprets this experience as a lesson, right? He uses it as a teaching moment. So the primary issue isn't the storm, but it's the disciples' fear, right? Remember, they were terrified, right? They woke him up, they're like, hello, help us. Um, and so thinking about that, Jesus' question to them, right, asking them, why are you so afraid? Do you still have no faith? His question challenges both the disciples within this story, but also us as the readers to recognize the difference between two worlds. One world is marked by fear, by chaos, and this sense of loneliness, this idea that we're controlled by the forces of evil and doubt. And the other is a world of faith. It's where God's kingdom is present. It's offering us peace and hope and the assurance that we are not abandoned. And so this shift is very risky and it's very challenging, but standing between these two worlds is the power of the good news of Jesus, the Messiah, who brings the kingdom of God into our midst and offers us a new future, a future that's not limited to just a few people, but is available and accessible to all. And with that, we'll move on to our next passage.
Now let's read Luke chapter 10, verses 25 through 37. On one occasion, an expert in the law stood up to test Jesus. Teacher, he asked, what must I do to inherit eternal life? What is written in the law? He replied. How do you read it? He answered, love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your strength, and with all your mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. You have answered correctly, Jesus replied. Do this and you will live. But he wanted to justify himself, so he asked Jesus, and who is my neighbor? In reply, Jesus said, a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho when he was attacked by robbers. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him, and went away, leaving him half dead. A priest happened to be going down the same road, and when he saw the man, he passed by on the other side. So too, a Levite, when he came to the place and saw him, passed by on the other side. But a Samaritan, as he traveled, came where the man was, and when he saw him, he took pity on him. He went to him and bandaged his wounds, pouring on oil and wine. Then he put the man on his own donkey, brought him to an inn, and took care of him. The next day he took out 2 denarii and gave them to the innkeeper. Look after him, he said, and when I return, I will reimburse you for any extra expense you may have. Which of these 3 do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of the robbers? The expert in the law replied, the one who had mercy on him. Jesus told him, go and do likewise.
All right, let's explore what's going on in this passage. So let's look at the context here. There's an expert in the law that tests Jesus by asking him what is required to inherit eternal life. Jesus points him back to his expertise, which is the law. And the man summarizes it by saying that it is loving God and loving one's neighbor. The man then asks Jesus to define neighbor, and Jesus begins to tell the parable of the Good Samaritan. So, the parable of the Good Samaritan is a powerful illustration to us of true compassion that challenges cultural and religious norms. So, the priest and the Levite, who are expected to be exemplars of righteousness because they knew God's law, they were considered to be religious leaders, ignored the man, likely due to concerns about ritual purity or social status. But I want to point out that in Jesus' story, there's no excuse that's provided or accepted for their lack of action. The audience at this point, right, that was listening to this story would have expected Jesus to mention a Jewish man helping, which would reinforce their condemnation of the religious leaders. But Jesus doesn't do that, right? Plot twist, right? Jesus surprises them by making the hero of the story a Samaritan, which is a person from a group despised basically by the Jews, both racially and religiously. And in that time, Jews viewed Samaritans as worse, the worst Gentiles or worse than any Gentile group out there. And it was widely believed that helping a Gentile, which is a non-Jew, right? So a non-Jewish person will be considered a Gentile. They widely believed that helping a Gentile was unnecessary or even harmful, right? There were some that even taught, not to help pregnant Samaritan women because then you were just helping to add to their population. You were helping to increase their numbers, and that would be harmful to the Jews, right? So this hatred is very much in disposition is very deeply rooted here. Yet the Samaritan is the one that not only stops to help, but goes above and beyond, right? He doesn't wait to be asked for help. He sees the need and takes immediate action. His help is sacrificial, right? His help is there's a cost. There's a cost associated with his help, right? He uses his wine and oil to treat the man's wounds. He which is both practical and compassionate, right? So the wine is kind of antiseptic, the oil to kind of help a balm almost like to kind of ease the pain. He even puts the man on his own donkey, which means that he was riding along, so now he has to walk because there's someone sitting on the donkey here, showing that he's willing to do this in order for the injured man to truly be cared for. And additionally, the Samaritan gives 2 denarii to the innkeeper to cover the man's stay, which ensures, I looked it up, I was like, well, how long could he stay on that amount? A few weeks, right? So he really, he didn't just cheap out and say, oh, after a night, you'll be okay. You'll figure it out on your own. He's like, no, you're going to need time to heal. You're going to need time to get yourself back together. Let me make sure that you aren't worrying about that burden while you're trying to get better physically and probably mentally after being in such a ordeal. This action goes beyond the expected. It shows that true neighborliness is about mercy and, like I mentioned before, sacrificial love. It's not merely following religious rules or laws. And Jesus here is teaching that compassion transcends cultural boundaries and that showing mercy is far more important than adhering to any social or religious norm. He's like, don't get so caught up in the rule that you miss out on the human that's in front of you, right? You miss out on doing an act with selfless kindness, right? Towards all people, no matter their background. So some of the things that I want to point out from this particular passage is that the parable of the Good Samaritan really does challenge us to think or rethink, I would say, who our neighbors are, right? It's easy to love those, to help those, to care about those who are like you, right? It's very simple. But Jesus is teaching us here that true love extends beyond familiar faces, which can be hard, right? That can be very, very difficult. The Samaritan, an outsider and an enemy of the Jews, shows the greatest mercy. This teaches us that genuine love isn't just for those who are similar to us, but it's for everyone, even those who are different, whether it's due to race, beliefs, or background. Again, which can be difficult. At no point, and the reason I keep saying that is because at no point does Jesus say that it was easy for him to do it. It said that he did it, right? And so I want us to keep that in mind as well. True love is able to break down different barriers that may be out there. And so I really love that this is here to kind of serve as that example for us. Now I want to explore acting with mercy. We've talked a little bit about that, but I want to explore just a little bit deeper. The Samaritan doesn't just see the wounded man, he acts, and he acts with mercy, even when it's inconvenient and it's costly. He gives his time, of his resources, of his comfort, right? And Jesus is teaching us here that true mercy isn't just about feeling sympathy. I can admit I've definitely fallen into that trap of oh, I feel sorry for them, and then that's all that I do, right? It requires action. So whether it's your time, your money, your emotional energy, mercy often demands sacrifice. And so Jesus again is showing that living out your faith means going beyond your words, right? It means actively helping others. And so it just made me think, even when it costs me something, how can I continue to show mercy? How can I be better about making sure that I'm, not just saying some nice things, but I'm putting some elbow grease into what it is that I'm saying. And then the last piece, I want to talk a little bit about some self-reflection here. The priest and Levite justify their inaction, possibly out of fear or convenience. But it really did challenge me to think, am I like them? Right? Do I sometimes pass up on someone that's in need and justify that because I'm too busy or because I'm uncomfortable, right? And it just made me think about how Jesus is calling us to confront these excuses and really evaluate what's going on in our hearts. So I can only speak for me, but if that is something that you want to explore, let us know in the comments down below. Because again, discipleship means going beyond your own comfort to show mercy, especially to those that are outside of your inner circle. In this parable, it really it challenged me genuinely to think about how I can better align my actions with my faith. And so, one of the things that I want to start doing, and I encourage you to do as well, is actively seek out those opportunities to show mercy, right? To really redefine neighbor and what that means to you so that it better reflects what Jesus believes is a neighbor, right? He even asked, he was like, which of these three do you think was a neighbor to the man who fell into the hands of robbers? The one who had mercy on him. Right? So how can we be better about having mercy on others? And with that, we'll move on to our next passage.
Now, let's read John chapter 11, verses 32 through 44. When Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. "Where have you laid him?" he asked. "Come and see, Lord," they replied. Jesus wept. Then the Jews said, See how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. It was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he has been there 4 days. Then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? So they took away the stone. Then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of the people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. When he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. The dead man came out, his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. Jesus said to them, take off the grave clothes and let him go.
Now, let's explore this passage. So, first, Mary expresses a similar thought to one that Martha had earlier on within the chapter. If Jesus had been there, her brother wouldn't have died. This shows that she has faith in Jesus' power, despite her grief. It's just a limited faith, right? She believed, oh, you had to have been here. You needed to physically do this thing in order for a miracle to occur. Next, we see Jesus having an emotional response. He is deeply moved by the sorrow and the mourning that's going on around him. Like within verse 35, Jesus weeps, right? Jesus wept. And this shows us, I think, his empathy and compassion for those that are grieving, and how it's a reflection of how God really is moved by our emotions, right? He's not this heartless being out there, but he feels with us as well. Next, we see the crowd's reaction, and the crowd is divided, right? Some affirm Jesus' love by saying, see how he loved him, while others criticize him for not doing more for the now dead Lazarus, right? They say things like, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man, which happened in chapter 9, if you're curious, if you want to go check that out, keep this man from dying, right? Very accusatory. And the reaction is no less divided even after Lazarus rejoins the land of the living. Although Jesus does ensure, freedom for Lazarus in verse 44, as we saw, the following verses, which we didn't read, but I encourage you to do so, we see that while there are some that believe because of what they saw, there are others in the crowd that go off and begin to plan how to eliminate both Jesus and Lazarus, right? They're looking to stop the outrageous behavior of someone who calls the dead back to life, and the dead who have the audacity to listen to and obey that authority, right? So getting a little ahead there, but I wanted to point out just how divided, and that's a theme that continues even up until his crucifixion. And so Jesus orders the stone to be rolled away, prompting concern from Martha due to the smell of the decaying body that's been there for 4 days. Jesus, of course, reassures her by emphasizing the importance of belief in witnessing God's glory, right? He even says, did I not tell you that if you believe, you will see the glory of God? I do want to point out here, though, that in ancient Jewish tradition, it was believed that a person's soul could potentially return to the body within 3 days. But after that, all hope was lost. There was absolutely no hope of revival. So by waiting 4 days, Jesus defied this belief and showed that he had power over death. And then we have the miracle. So Jesus prays aloud, again, demonstrating or using this as an opportunity to demonstrate his connection with the Father, and then calls Lazarus out of the tomb. Lazarus responds, and Jesus then instructs those around him and those that are present to remove the grave clothes, symbolizing the freedom that comes with having new life. And so now let's talk a little bit about some of the symbolism that's going on here. First, I want to talk about God's compassion. So Jesus weeping within John 11 demonstrates his, again, deep compassion and empathy for the grief of others. It is a powerful reminder that God is not distant or indifferent to our pain, but he is present with us in our sorrow. And so Jesus, in his humanity, shares our suffering, validating our emotions and showing that it's okay to grieve. If Jesus can weep, so can I, so can you, so can they, so can he, so can she, right? All of that. We can weep, right? Feel all of the feels. I want to point out that earlier within this chapter, around verse number 3 or 4, that Jesus declares that Lazarus' illness will not end in death, but it will be used to glorify the Son of God. So he knows how the story is going to end and still makes room for those heavy feelings, right? So knowing that Jesus understands and can and weeps with us can hopefully bring you some immense comfort during your time of loss or your time of hardship, because it helps to remind all of us that he is near within our moments of pain. Next, I want to talk a little bit about faith and belief. So when Jesus tells Martha that if she believes, she will see God's glory, right? Verse 40, he challenges her and he challenges us to have faith, right? Even in situations that seem hopeless. So trusting God's power and timing means that despite circumstances, we can have confidence that God is working things out for his glory and for our good, right? And sometimes that can feel silly and that can be hard because we want to rationalize. If you're anything like me, I like to rationalize and say, okay, see how this is going to work out and then this is going to happen. So when I get to a point where I don't see that, it gets really, really hard, right? It becomes really difficult. But this invitation to believe extends beyond simply believing in the outcome, but also in God's sovereignty over all situations, right? So in moments of doubt or in moments of difficulty, holding on to faith allows us to experience God's transformative power and his peace, just as Martha witnessed when Jesus raised Lazarus. So this kind of is a great segue into talking about the importance of God's glory. So this miracle of raising Lazarus was not only about bringing a dead man back to life, which is great and awesome and really cool, but also about revealing God's glory to those that were present, right? It was an opportunity for people to witness God's divine power at work in a way that would lead them to believe in Jesus as the Son of God. And very similar to what goes on in our lives are meant to reflect God's glory, especially when we experience his intervention in difficult times. I don't know if you've ever, been in a situation where you say, this was nobody but God. There's no other way to describe it. There's no other person, thing, group, whatever, that can get credit for what is going on. And I think that's what's happening here, right? That is a very similar case. And it shows us that by trusting God and living with a focus on his glory, we can become a living testimony to his greatness. And it shows, just like those that, saw Lazarus rise from the dead and were drawn to faith, it can happen for those that were near you and present in your life when God was able to use the situation, no matter how difficult or how tumultuous it might have been, to have his name be glorified, right? To I basically say he got the credit sometimes that's what how I like to rationalize it in my mind is that God is like I'm the one moving and I need credit for the work that I've done. I work in the academic space and we're often talking about, who's getting credit for this work, right? Whose name is getting put on this. And God wants to make sure that his name is on, the wonderful and amazing blessings that are coming into your life. And he wants to make sure others know that it's his name that's on that work as well. So next, I want to talk a little bit about death and resurrection. So the resurrection of Lazarus really does serve as kind of a powerful foreshadowing of what's to come, thinking about Jesus' own resurrection, right? Which ultimately bring hope to all who believe in him, right? So Jesus demonstrated his power over physical death, showing that he is the giver of life, not only in this world, but for eternity. And so this miracle reminds us that death is not the final word, just as Jesus said earlier in this chapter, right? Whether it's our physical death or spiritual death, we, that we experience apart from God, right? No matter what that might be, death is not the final word, right? And as believers, we have the honor and the privilege to hold on to the promise of eternal life, right? Knowing that Jesus conquered both the physical and spiritual death for us, right? And lastly, I want to talk about responding to the call. So Jesus makes this call and Lazarus responds, right? Lazarus does, in fact, get up. So when Jesus called Lazarus to come out of the tomb, he was not just calling a dead man to life, which again, very cool, but symbolizing the call to every believer to respond to him, right? So just as Lazarus left behind his grave clothes and walked into a new life, we are invited to leave behind our grave clothes of sin and death when we accept Jesus' call. And so this response to Jesus requires a willingness to embrace a new life, kind of this act of shedding the past and stepping into freedom that comes from following him, right? And so sometimes you're gonna need a little help to get all this stuff off. But that's the call that he has made, and it is definitely a call worth answering. Thanks so much for studying the Bible with me. We explored some pretty awesome passages related to Jesus' teachings and miracles. Just so you know, the teaching doesn't stop there. If you want to explore a different passage or story, let us know in the comments down below and we're added to our list. Stay tuned for the final video in this series where we explore the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus, just in time for Resurrection Sunday.